I'm with Tricia Miller from Camera. Tricia, remind us again, what is Camera?
CAMRA is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. It's a media watchdog organization that's been watching the media, correcting the media, holding the media accountable, calling for truth in the media concerning Israel since 1982. And I am the director of the Partnership of Christians and Jews. And so my particular focus is the Christian world and watching what's going on in the Christian world in relation to Israel.
We're now quite a few months through the war with Gaza. How has the media reporting been on this so far?
It's been horrible. It's very biased. It's very inaccurate. It's deceptive. They use little bits of information to make the rest of their story sound credible. They use misleading headlines. They leave out context. I could go on, but it's very deceptive and very biased. And if you watch all the mainstream media, you can see that they're all putting out the same narrative.
Is there a big difference between secular media and Christian media?
Yes, in general, the predominant Christian media is much more factually based. And I mean, you have like CBN that's located right there in Jerusalem. They take great pains to report the facts, to report the stories as they are.
So really, people should be getting their media from the Christian media rather than from the secular media if they're going to actually put a better narrative out.
Yes, definitely.
Mhm.
And then
Does it shock?
not all the Christian world is consistent. There is, another part of the Christian world that is also anti-Israel, unfortunately. But the predominant media sources, such as CBN, are putting out the facts.
Does it shock you how secular media is towards Israel?
Yes and no. Yes, it's shocking. It's disappointing that they can't be more objective and look for the facts and look for the truth. But on the other hand, it's not shocking because what they're doing and saying is nothing different. They just have a different format. They have media now, but it's nothing different than what the rest of the world has said about Jews for more than 2,000 years. There's been anti-Semitism much longer than the Christian history, but then for the last 2,000 years, there's also been anti-Semitism in the Christian world. And what is striking is that everything that's been said about Jews for more than 2,000 years is now being said about Israel. Israel is the corporate Jew. And so the foundation of all of this bias and lies is this incredible animosity towards the Jewish state and holding the Jewish state to a double standard that no other nation is held to.
What sort of distortion or lies are we actually hearing about and seeing?
Well, I'd like to talk about civilian casualties and the false charge of genocide, if that's okay. And I'd like to talk about the deceptiveness of a lie. And let me just start with an example from the book of Esther, because we just observed the holiday of Purim this last Sunday. That's the holiday that's instituted in the book of Esther after the Jews were victorious in defeating the enemies who came to kill them. That story is a story of self-defense. The Jews did not initiate killing. They were given permission by the king to defend themselves against those who came to kill them. And that's very applicable to what's going on now in Israel. That's another subject. But what Haman is the villain in the story of Esther, and what he said to the king to get the king's permission to have an edict to kill the Jews was a mixture of truth and lies. He goes to the king and he says, there's this people all through your kingdom, and they have their own set of laws. They obey their own laws. And then he says, they don't obey the laws of the king. Okay, the first part's true, that yes, the Jews have their own set of laws given to them at Sinai that they observe, but he mixed in a lie saying, but they don't obey the king's laws, and that's what makes them dangerous to the king. And so he gets the king's permission, and that's exactly what's happening now. The media uses mixture of truth and lies. So they mix in a little bit of truth, it makes their lies sound credible. On the subject of civilian casualties, the media and many of the world's governments are talking constantly about the number of so-called civilians. And there's a whole bunch of issues here, even in how we identify who the civilians are, which you might want to get into or not. But
It would be good to get into that to find out who are these people who are actually being killed.
Yes, okay. So the only source of numbers that we have for so-called civilians being killed is Hamas. Hamas is the terrorist organization that started this war. They do nothing but lie. We can't trust their numbers. And Hamas's figures, when they do give a figure, they're currently saying 31,000 civilians have been killed by Israel, which is what's leading to the world, crying out that Israel's committing a genocide, which is also totally false, and we need to debunk that as well. But Hamas's figures don't differentiate civilians from the number of terrorists. They're just throwing out a number, 31,000 dead, and they're not saying if there's terrorists or civilians. And one of the problems there, beside the fact that Hamas lies and the numbers are inflated, is that the terrorists dress as civilians because they know that the IDF does not target civilians. So they run around dressed in civilian clothing. So the lie here is that Israel is targeting civilians. The truth is there have been some civilian deaths. Yes, there are always civilians who suffer and die in the middle of a war, especially in an urban environment like this, like in Gaza. But the lie is that Israel's doing it intentionally. The truth is that any civilian deaths are the result of actions on the part of Hamas, and I can get into that more of how they cause the civilian deaths. But the truth is that the IDF goes to extreme measures to protect civilian life.
Of course, if you're dressed as a civilian, that's actually a war crime if you're actually part of a combatant as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. They're intentionally deceptive. They don't walk around with their weapons. They have their weapons stashed in the doorways of buildings where they know, they know where they are. They can grab them when they need them, but they don't want to be targeted. The Israelis have drones up, there's very good surveillance, and they don't want to be targeted by the IDF. So they dress as civilians. There's a man named John Spencer, and he's the chairman of the Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, America's military academy. So and he's a veteran too of multiple wars. So he's an expert. And what he says is that the number of civilian deaths is unknown. The current Hamas number is 31,000. They don't acknowledge any terrorist deaths, any combatant, any of the fighters' deaths. The IDF estimates that it's killed about 13,000 Hamas terrorists. So even if Hamas's number of 31,000 killed is accurate, which nobody thinks it is, except the media that keeps repeating it, but none of the experts, though, think that 31,000 is accurate. Even if that's accurate, and you subtract the 13,000 Hamas terrorists that Israel says it has killed, that would mean there's 18,000 civilians that have died at the most. And the ratio of combatants to civilians then would only be 1.5, which is horrible. I mean, none of us want to see civilians die, but this is a much, much lower ratio than in any other war. In any, like, for example, John Spencer gives this example in the Battle of Mosul, that there were 10,000 civilians killed compared to 4,000 ISIS terrorists. So that's a much higher. So in other words, Israel is doing a much better job at protecting civilians than any other army ever has.
And of course, as well, Hamas is actually within the civilian population as well. So it's even harder to actually try and protect the civilians when Hamas are actually mixed in with the civilians.
Yes, and so that's one of the issues is that Hamas intentionally uses their civilians as human shields. All of their rocket launching sites, their weapon storage, they're all in civilian sites, many homes. As the IDF has been going house to house in Gaza, they are discovering that in the vast majority of homes, there are weapons stored. And there are openings to the tunnels, the vast, vast network of tunnels that Hamas uses to move around, get around through Gaza, and use for terrorist attacks. So they put their rocket launching sites in hospitals, in mosques, and schools. And so then when Israel takes out the rocket launching sites, the media and the world can scream, oh no, Israel's shooting at civilian sites. No, Israel specifically targeted a rocket launching site. It just happened to be in a civilian location because that's what Hamas does.
And we've seen this with the hospital, with the Shifa hospital as well, haven't we? Hamas has been right in there.
Yes, and there again, the media is screaming that how dare the IDF go into a hospital? Hospitals are supposed to be civilian places, they're supposed to be a safe place in war. How dare IDF go in there and to get terrorists who are hiding there? There's no mention. This is another example of the double standard. There's no mention made of the fact that the terrorists are in the hospital. And the IDF has so far arrested or killed at least 500, and there's more. They're still having to go room to room in the hospital. And the terrorists are shooting out the windows at the IDF. They're shooting from the maternity ward. Can you imagine? Where, the most vulnerable place, you would think, the place that should be the most protected in a hospital, the maternity ward. So the IDF is going into the hospital to root out these terrorists. They are having doctors accompany them to make sure that they can take care of patients along the way. And the IDF is also carrying food and water and medical supplies in for the patients who are in the hospital. They are doing more than any other army has ever done to protect civilians. Back to the charge of, you said we wanted to talk about the charge of genocide. The world is claiming that Israel's committing a genocide. If Israel wanted to commit a genocide, the definition of genocide is wiping out an entire people. If they wanted to do that, they could have just bombed Gaza. They could have just destroyed it all in a day. If they wanted to commit genocide, even in the case of the Shifa hospital, they could just bomb the hospital. Instead, they risk IDF soldiers' lives to have them go in to only find the terrorists and not hurt civilians.
So I imagine basically if you say something long enough, then people will begin to believe it. And we are hearing a lot of people saying, oh, there's genocide happening. Is that sort of the tactic? If you keep saying it long enough, people will believe it?
Yes, well, we saw how well that worked in World War II with the Nazis. Goebbels, who was the head of propaganda for the Nazi party, he said, if you repeat a lie, tell a big lie and repeat it often enough, it gets to become believed. It gets to be considered to be the truth. And that's exactly what's happening now. This is a big lie that Israel targets civilians, that Israel is committing genocide. Israel does what no other army does in the world. It's a very bad military strategy. They warn civilians ahead of time when they're going to take out a site. They drop leaflets. They make calls on people's cell phones. They send texts. They warn the civilians to get out of the way because, oh, we're going to attack here. No other army does that. And that's really bad strategy because you lose the whole element of surprise. But that's what they do to try to protect civilians. And then back to the whole subject of civilians, they've got terrorists embedded in them. You have terrorists hiding in the civilian population. So
how is the humanitarian aid situation on the ground in Gaza? And are Hamas actually helping to distribute aid to the most vulnerable and needy?
no, they're not. And here again, this is another one of the big lies that Israel's trying to create a famine in Gaza. They're trying to starve them, and they're not letting any humanitarian aid. The exact opposite is true. Many, many trucks are going over the border every day with supplies. However, the Hamas takes control of the trucks. They take control and they are protecting all of the trucks with all of the supplies with guns. And they are shooting civilians who run to the trucks, who try to get anything. They shoot civilians who do need supplies, who are trying to get them. And so when the world thinks, in its humanitarian mindset, we need to help these poor civilians who are suffering because of the war, they think they're sending in supplies to help them. All they're doing is strengthening Hamas. They're supplying Hamas because Hamas is taking the supplies.
Are they eventually giving out this food or are they selling it on the black market?
There's also a lot of that going on. They're selling, yes, there's different tribes too that operate within Gaza, within Arab culture in general. It's a tribal society, and there's different tribes who get their hands on stuff and they're selling it, yes, at very inflated prices.
So really, Hamas are actually an enemy of their own people.
Well, they are, and there are some Gazans who recognize that. We have seen some footage of Gazans, cheering Prime Minister Netanyahu, cheering Israel for what they're doing, because they realize if Israel wins, they'll be delivered from Hamas. But unbelievably, in spite of all the suffering and the way that Hamas mistreats their civilians, about 80% of the civilians support Hamas. They are in favor of what happened on October 7th. And they're totally of the same mindset that the Jews need to be destroyed.
So they still support Hamas, even though Hamas has brought all this death and destruction on them by Israel going in and dealing with Hamas.
Yes, because they're so brainwashed from the time they're born, really, and all their school books in school, the kids are taught this. The IDF has found books. They teach their children from the time they're born that the Jews they're apes, they're monkeys, they're horrible, creatures, and they're to be destroyed. So they grow up with this mentality. So it's embedded in them. And so back to the subject for a minute of innocent civilians, how do how do you talk about innocent civilians? 80% of them support Hamas, and many civilians went over the border following the terrorists on October 7th and participated in the killing, in the looting, in the taking of hostages. The released hostages have testified they were kept in civilian homes. They were imprisoned by, so-called civilians. So that's, if a civilian is taking a hostage and keeping a hostage in their home, are they still identified as a civilian? It's very murky territory here to try to even identify who are so-called innocent civilians.
When the media distort the narrative, is this a fear of being in an area that you might be, attacked by Hamas if you're in a Hamas area and reporting, or is it anti-Semitism?
Well, that probably both. If you're in an area that's under the control of Hamas, there's no freedom of the press. There's no freedom to say and to speak truth or to say what you think, even to, give an opinion that would differ. So there's definitely that. But there's also just embedded anti-Semitism in the world that, like I said earlier, is, at least 2,500 years old. And it's the current manifestation of it is just to oppose the state of Israel.
How can Christians pray for Gaza at the moment?
They can pray. This is my position, but it's based on everything that we're hearing from the Israeli government, that Israel must be allowed to finish this war. Israel is getting opposition from the world at this point. And just on Monday, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution that called on an immediate ceasefire. They also called for the releasing of all the hostages, but they did not make it contingent. They did not make a ceasefire contingent on the releasing of hostages, which means all this did was strengthen Hamas's position. And all you have to know that this was a really bad resolution is that Hamas likes it. So what's the effect of that is reinforcing Hamas's position, and the U.S. abstained and did not veto that, which is a horrible, horrible position that the United States has taken. So the prayer would be, I'm just giving that for some background, the prayer would be that Israel would be strengthened. Israel is really on its own now. It's really alone, with even the United States not supporting it, and the United States threatening to withhold weapons if they go into the last stronghold that they have to go in to get the rest of the Hamas battalions. So I would just ask that Christians pray for strength and wisdom for the Israeli leadership, the government and the IDF leadership, and for supplies. Israel needs supplies. You can't fight a war without bullets. And the U.S. is threatening to cut off supplies even. So again, Israel's on its own, and the IDF needs really supernatural wisdom, insight, strength, and physical supplies.
So really, Israel needs to go in to Rafah and deal with Rafah. Otherwise, they're not getting the whole job done. And a lot of it's been a waste of time if they don't deal with all the areas of where the terrorist hotbed is, isn't it?
Yes. They can't stop now. They have to finish the job. You can't, I think there were 20 battalions total, and now there's 4 left. So, you can't leave that many battalions in place. And the leader, Sinwar, is still somewhere, they assume, in those tunnels in the Rafah area. You can't leave some of the leadership and some of the battalions in place. When they have stated, Hamas has stated, they intend to repeat October 7th over and over again until there are no more Jews. So Israel has the right and the responsibility of taking out people who are intending to kill them, who have made it their public statement. It's in the Hamas charter. They intend to destroy Israel. Israel would be totally irresponsible to not take out people who intend to come kill them again.
Why doesn't America see this?
I don't know. I am sure that there is anti-Semitism as part of the foundation. There's also political interest, that our current administration has with different countries. And so, we're entangled with other countries in the world. And so there's pressure from those countries too, I'm sure. Well, for example, a previous version of this UN resolution, the United States had insisted on the wording being in there that a ceasefire was dependent on the releasing of the hostages, and China and Russia vetoed that. So then they had to go back and they had to, rework the wording. And then this latest version that came out this Monday that was passed removed the wording that the US had in there, making a ceasefire dependent on releasing the hostages. Now that's not in there. And Hamas is happy with this current version. And so is China and Russia. So, there's multiple reasons for why this current administration is acting the way it is, but it's not understanding that Israel must finish this job. If you leave, it's just like if you have a surgery, if you have cancer and you have a surgery, what if the surgeon only took out, part of it and left part? What's the point? Like you said, a lot of this would be a waste of time. You have to get it all.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you today. What's your website for people who'd like to know more?
It's www.camera.org. It's an excellent source of articles and information on all the current issues that come up each day in covering this war.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Tricia, for sharing today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's good to talk with you again.